So, at my core, I am a developer. I am someone that likes to sit alone and write code. Don't talk to me. I'm building something cool.
That is Chuck Liddell, CEO for Valence App Incorporated. I'm Josh Burke, your host for the Salesforce Developer Podcast, and here on the podcast, you'll hear stories and insights from developers for developers. Today, we sit down and talk with Chuck about a broad range of categories, including his work in the community and his love for architecture. And in fact, we start there, where he's talking about how he learned to combine business with technology.
So I don't come naturally to some of the sort of business side of things, running people, infrastructure, navigating sort of the financial aspects of running a business. And I've had a few opportunities for mentorship there that really helped me out. So that ice and water vending machine company, I was the CTO, and the person running it really took me under their wing and helped me they took me to the board meetings, and I was able to talk about technology at the board meetings and talk to the investors and stuff, and it helped me to kind of understand the language, at least, that people use and sort of how they interact at that level. And then when I really started to get into it more was after I left that company, I started my own consulting group, doing Salesforce consulting and other web consulting, but mostly Salesforce. And I had to run the company by myself, right? I was now the CEO of that. So that was the real crash course in how to run a business, for better or for worse. Lots of good stories and bad stories there. And
Nice.
I got a lot of learning out of that. And I really sort of enjoyed helping other people to figure out the stuff that I had been figuring out, kind of some things that I had just figured out and some things that I was still figuring out, but I was happy to share stories. And I was fortunate enough to get involved in more and more things kind of around technology and business blended together.
Gotcha. Something that I'm getting less and less surprised of is hearing that Venn diagram of architecture and MBA. I think it was Daniel Host when I interviewed him, and I was like, "You've got an MBA. That's incredible." He's like, "Actually, a lot of technical architects have an MBA because they do. You sit in that sphere between what the business needs, what the business can do, and then what the business is going to." Now, but going back to a second for what you were talking about there about you talking to other people, sharing your stories, sharing your experiences, kind of empowering them. You've done a lot when it comes to being part of the community and helping educate people. So let's do a quick whirlwind tour of that. For instance, I want to make sure we get this on tape that Marissa gave you the shout out during her Cactusforce presentation that she doesn't think Cactusforce like you're integral to getting that off the ground.
That is a wild exaggeration, and she's very kind.
She is very kind.
Marissa's the driving force behind that conference, and I just help her find technical content and prep it a little bit. Right? I help find people that want to do technical talks and sort of organize the developer track, and just sort of help her bounce ideas around. But really, she's so much of that all by herself.
And I hope anybody who heard that interview can hear just how passionate Marissa is. And, I would definitely, she feels like she seems like the kind of person that when she has a vision, she wants to get it done, and she's going to get it done, and very driven and passionate about that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. And the vision behind Cactusforce is a little unusual as far as community conferences go, right? They kind of went a different direction. As a community conference, you have to be, kind of cater more general because you have a smaller demographic, right? It's a smaller geography or smaller attention. But she's kind of gone the other direction and say, we're going to specialize in highly technical content, even though we're just in this one city in this one state, which is interesting.
I found it fascinating when I asked her, and I can't remember if this made it in the interview, it was just during the prep call, what her percentage of accepting content was. And her answer was, we're pushing towards almost 100% because we're actively trying to get those highly technical people on stage. It was such a more focused approach than what I'm used to, which is cast a wide net and then, bring what you can to the stage, which is usually a reduction rate of it's decimating your CFP basically. And on that, I don't want you to undersell a knack for finding, curating highly technical content. That's pretty hard to do, right? And we've worked together when it came to the extracurricular with Tom Newbirth. And tell me a little bit about your approach to that. How do you hear good technical content when you see it? And I know I just mixed my metaphors there, but
so there's multiple questions in there. But let's talk about the technical, understand it when you see it piece first. So I'm going to actually jump away and then come back. I interview a lot of people for jobs. right?
Okay.
Like it's a natural thing that I've been involved in for a long time. I help people interview when they hire. Like, it's just a skill set I have. And
Okay.
one of the things that I think is incredibly important for technical people that when they interview and explain sort of what they do is to be able to talk about something complex and make it digestible. I'm not saying dumb it down, make it simple, make it comprehensible to the person you're talking to. And so when I'm looking for someone that's very technical and that would do well sharing their knowledge, I'm looking for you're an expert at something, you've done a really complex, interesting work, and a requirement, you can talk about it in a way that I understand, whether people like me understand or people, there's an audience for you that you can connect with and share. There are a lot of people that are very technical and just can't, they lack the ability to communicate it clearly. And that's a critical piece. You really have to look for the Venn diagram of those two.
Yeah. Is that sort of you, going back to the original auditory sense, are you sort of hearing your CEO role when you're interviewing people in that they're explaining things in ways that relate to somebody who's in the business?
So there's certainly parallels. Going back to, since we're talking about college, I had a college professor that said, listen, if you can be an expert that straddles two complex domains, you will be way more valuable than people in either of those domains by themselves. Anybody that can be the liaison between two disciplines or two groups of people is a very valuable person. So if you have the ability to sort of interact with the tech folks and the business folks and bridge the gap, help them to understand each other, or at least if you understand so that you can synthesize design, right? The business folks say, we need this. The tech folks say, here are constraints. And you can say, okay, I'm going to combine these in my head and produce a design. Like you comprehend both those spaces. And anyone that's into sort of patterns, Eric Evans did an amazing book called Domain-Driven Design. And one of the key things in there is this idea of ubiquitous language. And ubiquitous language is the idea that the technology that we build will use nouns and verbs and stuff that reflect the business it's built for. And that that a developer and a business person that's functional can use the same words to mean the same thing.
Gotcha.
And that's all part of a larger sort of canvas of how do we communicate around technology.
Got it. Well, let's talk about that canvas a little bit. And I kind of spilled the beans a little bit earlier, but your work towards the extracurricular, like how did that come about? How did was it you and Tom and you were just both like, this content needs a stage? Like, what was the impetus of that?
So it's these things always get started in interesting ways.
Nice.
So the extracurricular as an idea, and we haven't defined it yet, so I will define it so people understand what we're talking about.
Thank you.
But I'll tell the story first. It got started in Paris. At French Touch Streamin' in 2017. I was in Paris doing a talk at French Touch Streamin', and a guy named Roger Mitchell was there. He's a great Salesforce developer. And he was talking to me about a conference that he had been to that was about JavaScript that didn't have any slides. People just talked tech. They just got up there and they talked about technology and they sat back down. And how cool was that? And couldn't we do something like that in Salesforce's world? Is there something like that that's like not slides, it's all about tech? So he started the ball rolling on this idea of like a not slides tech-oriented conversation. So the next iteration of that was like, okay, well, the TDX, right? Trail DX is where it's the developer-centric conference. So anything adjacent to that is going to be the most technical opportunity. So we said, let's do a bonus day after TDX where we just jam out in an auditorium somewhere and talk turkey for the whole day. And we'll just do it the day after, the day before TDX. So people are in town and we're likely to like capture as much of an audience of the kinds of people we want to have in this conversation.
Yeah.
So we started planning this through the user group and community programs. And as it started to develop, an interesting offer was made, which was, hey, this sounds really interesting. Would you be willing to do this as part of TDX? Would you kind of come inside instead of doing like a bonus content and just be part of TDX?
Yeah.
And that was kind of a novelty, wouldn't you say?
Oh, it's not a rarity. I think it's really the only time we've ever tried to do content curated and staged like that. Yeah,
it's an unusual format, right? Because the call for papers is not through Salesforce. It's just like, here's a stage, do your thing for a day.
Yeah.
But obviously collaborating on space and AV and structure and having conversations about speakers and that sort of things with people at Salesforce like you. Okay, so that's the setup. That's how this thing started. But what is it?
Yes.
The extracurricular is an intentional, complicated, expert-level conversation about something technical.
Okay.
And what I mean by that, here, let me give you an analogy.
Okay.
Imagine that you took some people that were really good car mechanics and some people that wanted to become really good car mechanics. And you brought them into a workshop and you took a car engine apart in front of them.
Mm-hmm.
And the experts talked to each other about the car engine as they're taking it apart.
Yeah.
And said, here's what this is, here's what this is. And they asked each other questions and kind of like share stories and share their knowledge with each other and with the people that were trying to learn at the same time. And you're all kind of dissecting this car engine together. And people are all learning. Even the experts are learning from the other experts. Even the novices are learning from other people that are in the room talking to them. So it's like this sort of collaborative learning around sort of a focal point, a complex thing that's being dissected and discussed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we wanted to make the extracurriculars. We wanted to take complex technical talks that were really sophisticated with lots of layers to them and spend the time we needed to dissect them and take them apart one layer at a time like an onion and really get into the core gritty bits of like what made this interesting or complicated or difficult and talk about it.
Yeah. And another unique thing about it is not only did you keep it highly interactive, but these are almost epic in scope. I mean, they're 90 minutes long. Where did you settle into, we need to let this thing be? Because, in the world of conferences, 60 minutes is almost an anathema these days. Like it just seems like a very long time to put any one person on stage. When did you start leaning into 90 minutes?
So we kind of went off of more organic conversations, right? If you're a very technical person and you're having lunch with someone that's very technical, you're probably at lunch for an hour or two, right? You're sitting there really jamming out on it. It's like, what's an ideal amount of time to let people really crunch on something? And 30s, no, you couldn't possibly. 60s still a little tight.
Yeah.
So interestingly enough, we have these epically long sessions, right? Every session's 90 minutes.
Yeah.
But they're also super low friction for the speakers. They're probably a lighter lift than a 30 or a 60. Ask me why.
I'm going to ask you why.
Because Tom and I knew that the kinds of speakers we wanted to have for the extracurricular may not be typical. I'm going to put a slide deck together and go pitch it and try to talk through my slide deck. They're probably busy, right? Because they're good at what they do. They're like deep in the trenches working on stuff. We want the greasy mechanics. We don't, so we want to get them out of the engine and come talk to us about what they're working on. And so we want to say, hey, you don't have to really do a lot of prep. We're going to ask you to talk about something you already did, right? A project you're actively involved in or you've done. And we're going to help you dissect it in front of an audience. So the format is split up into thirds. They spend 1/3 of the time talking about what they did. And that's as little slide work as possible. Show us code, show us the thing you built, talk about it, give us diagrams, draw on a whiteboard, whatever. Just help us understand what we're talking about for 30 minutes. And then we had an expert panel on stage, so a moderator and 3 panelists. And the purpose there is to jumpstart the conversation. So once we move into the second third, the panel talks to the speaker and helps it sort of digest what they just heard. Like, they ask follow-up questions, they probe into parts that didn't get covered completely, and they sort of tease out, what does this engine look like? What are the pieces and what do they do in front of the audience? The audience is just listening to all this and digesting. And then finally, the last third, we open it up to totally open Q&A. The audience gets involved. And the audience can ask questions. They can answer questions. The speaker can ask questions, answer questions. The panel can ask questions, answer questions. So totally conversational. So you just sort of do layer by layer, right? So you start with the speaker, then the speaker plus the panel, then everyone. Gotcha. It's a really interesting format for like getting everyone engaged, but also with different layers of capacity to be engaged, right? The purpose of having the expert speakers, the expert panel, is to help ask the kinds of questions that as an audience member, you might like to know the answer to, but you don't even know to ask the question right now.
Gotcha. And like I was reviewing some of the old ones, and it is kind of impressive. Like you had at least, and I'm going to guess based on what you just said, not just one, but people who are literally speaking publicly for like the first time, and they're doing this 90-minute jam session.
Yeah. So the first year we did it, we had one day, one stage, and we did 3 talks. And then we came back in 2019 and did it again. We got 2 days of TDX for it, and I was able to fit 7 talks in. So the second time we did it, the 7 talks, all told, so we had the speaker, moderators, panelists. Then we also had these quick talks, which were kind of the original idea, right? Like Roger Mitchell's original idea is like these short technical talks. So we had quick talks where we said, hey, come up and talk to us about something for 5 minutes. Just jam out, tell us about something you did that's cool, and sit back down. No slides. Like just show us a demo, talk about it, sit back down. We're not going to ask you questions, no Q&A.
Yeah.
And we pitched the quick talks as a way for people to get their foot in the door with speaking. Right. If you're not a comfortable speaker, And one of my favorite Quick Talk speakers, I won't mention them by name, I asked them if they were nervous about doing the talk.
Yeah.
And they said that like, if flying a jumbo jet was a 7, this was a 10. They were so freaked out about doing a 5-minute talk with no Q&A, right? It's really daunting.
Yeah.
So between the main talks and the quick talks, we had 42 different people on stage.
Nice.
The most recent time that we did the extracurricular.
Nice. And let's describe the car a little bit, because I think until some people, and hopefully we're going to put some eyeballs back on some of the recordings, I think until people see some of these flow diagrams. Like one of my favorite examples is the data fire hose one, where they're trying to do something like 100,000 transactions, like in a minute or something like per hour. Okay, and it's like, and they break down how they're handling transactions and queuing them and requeuing them and all of this kind of stuff. And it's a pretty crazy. It's like one of the craziest diagrams. You've probably seen some pretty crazy diagrams in your career, but like, what's out of all of these? Which ones? Like, what's a good description of like this was a complicated solution that we took apart and put back together again?
So I would say hands down, the most popular one that got the most follow-up questions, I think has been watched the most, is Anthony Huber's talk. Can you put your whole org in source control? Yes, with an asterisk on it.
You're right.
And he has done a ton of stuff. He's a very complicated org, and he had done a ton of work around getting everything in there, even the community stuff, even like the binary community stuff back before it was, changed to not be just binary files. And like everyone at the time that we were doing this, everyone was starting to get into DX and think about tooling and pipeline. Right. And the big question everyone was asking is like, how do I track everything? Right. And it's hard to track everything. There's a lot of complexity in the edge cases. So he had a great talk about that. He went through some really esoteric stuff about, pipeline, but it was timely and relevant and people loved it.
Gotcha.
So that was a great one. There were some really good sort of architecture type ones. So Ohad Edon's one that you just mentioned, the inbound data fire hose, was really technical about sort of layering of pieces and how do you get speed and where do you have bottlenecks and how do you improve and iterate. And really, I was looking for, when we were selecting talks, we were looking for people that had done just really complicated projects that were interesting and tricky. And I said, you don't have to tell me your success story. Like, I don't care about whether you were successful or not. Come tell us about something complicated that you were a part of and help us understand why it was complicated, the struggles you face and the challenges and how you tackle them, how you thought about how you're going to tackle them and how you tackled them and maybe you weren't successful. One of the talks we had the first year was Mike Topolovic, and he did a talk on building a data grid for Lightning. When this is back when it was Aura before LWCs. And he showed like 7 different versions of it. He's like, here's what I built first, and it was awful. Here's what I built second, it was still awful. Right? And like he just went through all the versions of what he had built. He's like, here's the latest, and it's still like there's stuff I would like to do to it, but it's pretty decent these days.
But it's pretty decent, yeah. Well, that's come up on the show a lot. It's like this concept, and I think developers, I think there's an inflection point where we just sort of accept it. And it's like, failure is not an option. It's going to be part of the journey. Like, you're not going to write your perfect Apex class the first time you write your perfect Apex class. Like, that's why we have refactoring. Yeah.
And I think that part of what we hope to do with some of these conversations is just show vulnerability, right? Show that even experts get it wrong a lot.
Yeah.
And really understand the patterns of how do you address what you got wrong? How do you understand when something might be wrong? And then how do you figure out why it was wrong and how to address it, right? Just like the patterns of thinking and problem solving and troubleshooting, I think are almost more valuable than like a specific technical feature or widget.
Right. Well, and that was one of the things I loved about the fire hose one was as they're describing the actual flow of things, it wasn't that I would ever use that diagram of events, but just hearing their business, like their data logic as to why this would do this and why this would do this, like that stuck in my brain as something like, oh, that's how, if I was ever faced with something this big, this is how you can think about it and then drive, your own solution. So really kind of valuable takeaways, even if it wasn't like that specific epic problem that I was going to try to solve.
And also just how people interact. I think one of the things, if we're kind of dissecting the extracurricular as an entity, I think one of the things we got most correct was having the expert panel on stage. There's some fascinating back and forth in the recordings between the panel and the speaker that the speaker would not even think to mention in their talk, but the panel starts kind of teasing out this idea, and you really start to comprehend this whole thing. You see it blown out like a 3D space in your head, and you can see all the little pieces connecting to each other, and having the panelists kind of develop their own comprehension in front of you live, like watching them learn and understand, just really clicked for a lot of people. And nice. I think that's like the singular, probably best thing we got right.
Nice. Okay, well, we have, there's a bunch of those online. We will point to those in the show notes. I highly recommend them for anybody listening. Even, 90 minutes sounds like it's going to be a chunk out of your day. I am actually surprised how much, like, you can almost play them in the background and then like kind of poke over your shoulder, and watch it on the monitor next to you as they kind of bring up the next highlights and things like that. So hugely recommended. Let's move on to another one of your big projects, which humorously I think came across my radar when we first started talking about doing a podcast here on Salesforce. Also around the same time I was supposed to reach out to you about their extracurricular. And I was like, hey, look, it's also Chuck. So tell me a little bit about openforce.org. Like, what is it and what brought you to start to bring that to life?
So I've got a lot of different sort of side hustles and passions. And one of them is I want people to collaborate more in the Salesforce developer space. And that is a combination of learning, like the extracurricular, and also code. So I really am a booster for Salesforce open source. And there are a few different people doing all kinds of different things. They're interesting projects that kind of stand alone, but there isn't really a fabric that ties it all together. So I'm hoping to start to kickstart some of that, especially as Salesforce themselves goes more open source in the way they think. For example, Lightning Web Components, open source framework as opposed to Aura, which was open source with some of the platform stuff, not so much. So just like there's this shift, I think, ecosystem wide to be a little more interested and embracing of open source stuff.
Yeah.
And it's notoriously difficult to use anything open source in Salesforce because packaging and distribution is so specific, right? So you can't bring in any kind of libraries really. And there's packaging and that sort of a thing, but then there's like these weird dependencies and stuff. And there's not like a good version dependency declaration system, right?
Right.
And so I would say that even though Salesforce has been around for a long time, open source on the platform is still kind of early and is in its infancy. And so OpenForce, which is open-force.org, is a pretty simple website just meant to be a collection point, which is just like a low terrain where the water runs downhill. And it just collects essentially an index of all kinds of open source projects that people are involved in. Okay. And it's GitHub centric. And so we just index them. We show like how many stars they have, who's the author, what's it about, some tags that kind of categorize it. We let you search and filter. So it's really just a window into what's happening with open source on the platform. And we pair it with a community behind it. So there's a podcast called Good Day, Sir. And they have a great developer podcast for Salesforce run by Jeremy and John. And they have a Slack that they put together for just people to interact with them around the podcast that has taken on a life of its own. And this podcast community on Slack is 1,300 people, so 1,300 people in there at this point. Oh, wow. And it's really just about architects, developers, admins talking to each other and sharing information. And so we decided to kind of put the conversational aspects of the open source stuff in Slack there. Rather than create like a brand new Slack for it, we said, let's find a community that's already pretty technical and just kind of attach to them so that we aren't reinventing the wheel. So we have a channel in that Slack community. Anybody can be part of it. So gooddaysirpodcast.com/community to join the Slack. And you can find us in the Open Force channel if you want to talk open source on Salesforce, or better yet, help us work on the website because it's open source as you'd expect. It runs on Heroku dynos, and we'd love to have people help us to make it better.
Right, because that was my next question. Is like this is not just an open source repository; it's an application to show an open source repository, which is also open source. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, you got it.
I like how. So, but would you also describe it as like kind of a thin veneer on GitHub itself? So is that kind of my low barrier of entry to it? If I have is getting my repo up on GitHub and making it open source and public and all of that kind of stuff. What's the next step if I wanted to submit this to my project to openforce.org?
So anybody can send an email to dev@open-force.org to have a repo considered. A lot of authors send their repos into us to get indexed, but then also people that just like a library will send it to us too. So it's not always the authors that are sort of self-publishing. It's all kinds of people saying, hey, this is a really cool library. Didn't see it on your website. Let's get it added.
Got it.
So it grows pretty organically. We get a few submissions a week.
Okay. And I'm assuming you're basically just kind of looking for relevancy to the Salesforce developer. Is there specific traits that you're looking for, or is this just basically kind of like you want to make sure that it's not just like a garbage repo that somebody's just throwing at you?
So it's interesting. There's a whole conversation to be had just on that one question, which we won't get into right now. But the short version is that we wanted to do kind of a multiple passes. We had a lot of conversations with the group that put this together about would we editorialize or not? Like, would we have an opinion about these repos and rate them or include or not include based on our opinions?
Yeah.
And we decided that we would not.
Okay.
That basically anything that was actually Salesforce and actually like a real open source thing, we would include.
Okay.
And then later on, we would add tags or markers or something, stamps of approval, whatever, on top of the index to indicate things that were maybe more opinion-based as a supplementary marker rather than a gatekeeper for inclusion overall.
Got it. Makes a lot of sense. Speaking of opinion, do you have a favorite?
I think, ever popular are the financial force libraries that people put together, like FFlib.
Yes.
Those are huge. Andy Fawcett's such a figurehead in that community.
Yeah.
I'll put a plug from my own open source thing. The most successful open source thing I've ever written for Apex is a JSON parser. A silly little thing. But it was like, okay, you can deserialize into a type, which is great unless you have like object properties, and then you can't. Or if you don't know the exact shape in advance. But your alternative is like, okay, I've got a map string of object. Inside of that, there's a map string of object. Inside of that, there's a list of object, which inside of that's a map string of like you get this like really Byzantine data shapes.
Yeah.
So I just wrote a parser that like you can use pretty simple language like this index 2, and then just pull it out.
Got it.
And that's out of all the stuff I've done, that's the most popular thing.
But I mean, anybody who has gone through that map, I'm trying to think of a diplomatic word for it, but it's like just map on map. It just keeps
it's a casting nightmare.
Yes, exactly. And it's just like it's a weird cascading map structure. So I think anybody who has hit that pain point, you're doing good work out there, sir.
Yeah. So we use it's a tree model. Essentially, every node's a tree. So every return is a JSON parse node. So you start with a JSON parse node, you do a get, you get another JSON parse node. So you basically are just navigating a tree of nodes.
Gotcha.
And then when you're ready to actually get the backing data, there's like a get string value, get date time value and stuff. And we do a little bit of conversion too. So like if, to make it friendly.
Got it. Okay. So the other project I wanted to touch on, which I feel like this is going to be kind of like we're going to slowly be peeling back the onion a little bit, but you did a talk at the recent London's Calling, and I'm quoting your abstract here. Skip the boilerplate custom metadata type presentation and get right into the weird and advanced stuff. So what exactly are you building here?
So if you're going to use like one sentence to describe my contribution to the Salesforce ecosystem, it would be like the weird and advanced technical stuff. Like, that's just sort of my trademark.
Right. Fair.
I gave a great talk, a brief digression, gave a great talk a couple years ago at Forcelandia about about hacking the metadata API to manipulate change sets using a custom UI. I wrote my own UI to edit change sets. And there's this weird little edge case in the metadata API where you can, if you use the change set name as the package name, you can actually use the metadata API to manipulate change sets in certain ways, not full featured.
Really?
And the change set in the setup menu, the UI for that's kind of not great.
Right.
And so I wrote a cut. So I did like this whole hacky thing. And the whole talk was like, this is really weird. And I don't know if I would necessarily recommend it, but it works. And like, here's how I did it. So this is like the kinds of thing. Okay. So this talk most recent was called Advanced Custom Metadata Types Down the Rabbit Hole, Alice. And I just feel like I've done so much stuff with custom metadata types ever since they came out. I'm probably one of the people pushing the limits on what they can do and understanding them at a really deep level. That I just felt it was important to do a talk that kind of pulled together all the random little stuff. So the first third of the talk, I talked about a complex engine that I work on as part of the Valence, which is my main day job.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second third was like bugs that have existed and what they are and what they look like, and ones that have been fixed, ones that are not. And then the third was just like, here are things you should know, like school fees paid. Here are all the little learnings. There's some really weird little things, even in some of the new stuff that came out. So for example, there's the new fancy static get custom metadata types, right? You can just call them without using SOQL.
Right.
But if you have long text array fields, they truncate to 255 characters silently.
Oh.
So just be aware that it truncates long text array fields if you use that method instead of SOQL.
Gotcha.
Just little stuff like that. So I just have like a laundry list. The presentation's available.
Okay.
To anyone that attended that, and they're also going to put it out publicly pretty soon.
Got
There's
it.
essentially like a laundry list of like, here's 12 things that you should really know that like maybe not a lot of people know, but you should know about custom metadata types.
So first, I love that because I feel like custom metadata types are one of those things that's like almost crack on the platform. Like you don't think it's going to get addictive, and then you start putting it in places and it just starts helping in so many. It's like it really wants to be helpful. And it does such a good job of it.
Well, custom metadata types are one of my two favorite features that were ever added to the Salesforce platform. I think they are a game changer. They're amazing how powerful they are, and people don't understand like what you could do with them.
Give me like a night day example of something. If I'm not thinking custom metadata in my head right now, and I'm doing it in some other bullheaded way, like a custom object that I'm feeding data into or something like that, and then like convince me how powerful a custom metadata type is.
So I'll give you an example. So our application, so I'm the CEO of Valence, and it's an integration managed package. That's an ISV built on Salesforce. And so it's all about integrations. And people can write Apex code for how to talk to some other endpoint. They can write the configuration for which S objects are going to be moved back and forth at endpoint, the mappings, and the behavior for those mappings, all as custom metadata types in one package. They can promote it or package it and send it around. They could package it and then sell it because like it's a QuickBooks one in their QuickBooks, and they want to make like a pre-built QuickBooks, easy to use, drop in, and you can do QuickBooks, it automatically connects or whatever.
Yeah.
And someone else could repackage it with extra mappings and extra definitions of configuration behavior, and then it gets to the customer. So you get like 3 layers of people that have contributed layers to this thing. And when you're the customer, you just like a click, install, done. But there's all this work that went into it, and it's only because custom metadata types allow for that extension behavior. Nice.
Okay. Before I let you go, I want to talk 2 more things because I want to make sure we give a shout out. Well, first of all, let's go ahead and give a shout out. And you're one of the many people who have worked with like Don Robbins and Pluralsight. Like, what kind of courses do you have there for helping people learn like Salesforce architecture?
So Don Robbins does a series called Play by Play, and he essentially has conversations with different experts about certain topics. And they're amazing because, as I think is pretty clear from this podcast, I'm a big fan of conversational learning. I think it's a great way to learn something is to watch people talk about it.
Yeah.
And so Don kind of proxies the audience and asks kinds of questions that he thinks they might want to know in that moment.
Got it.
And we've done 2 together. We did one called Authenticating External App and Service Integrations with Salesforce, which was all about name credentials, OAuth, different ways to do OAuth flows with Salesforce, the SOAP API versus the REST API, and session management, all kinds of crazy stuff that's like hard to tease out. And we just did a bunch of visual examples, like here's the actual payload, here's what it looks like, and then we changed it, and here's what it looks like now. So we did that one, and then we did one called Understanding Lightning Web Components for Salesforce Developers when LWCs first came out. And we did sort of a compare and contrast Aura to Lightning Web Components as you make the transition to kind of help people bridge the gap.
Gotcha. Nice. Okay, so you've worked with Salesforce on the Trail of DX stage. You've worked with various dreaming events. You've done presentations for them. You've helped Marissa out with Cactusforce, but you're also very active locally. What are you doing with your local community?
So I live in Honolulu, Hawaii. I'm one of the co-hosts of the Hawaii user group for Salesforce. So, pretty small group, probably 30 people that meet and talk Salesforce. And I'm pretty involved in trying to help people build careers down here. Hawaii's an interesting market, right? There's a lot of tourism is sort of the main way people make money. And there's not a lot of opportunity for tech. There's a little bit of tech, but it's not a ton. So I see Salesforce as an opportunity for people locally to build tech skills and to branch out into more higher paying jobs. It's really about getting people jobs, getting them money.
Got it.
And so there are a few different things I'm involved in. The user group itself, there's also a workforce development program that started down here last year called HIAPO. which is run by a nonprofit called Purple Maya. And their thing was like, okay, let's build IT courses that are short, kind of bootcamp style, which is pretty popular these days, around like getting people from zero to something with technology. And they decided to make Salesforce a big piece of that. So the user group and myself have been kind of helping them to work on the curricula or talk about like what should be covered, or talk to some of the people. We've had cohorts from that kind of come down to the user group and present their capstone projects and talk to us and learn from us. And that's been really sort of collaborative. There's also an accelerator down here called Blue Startups. Okay. That helps to just sort of do general tech, not really Salesforce specific. And I'm a mentor there and part of the selection committee for choosing groups to come through. And they're one of the top 20 accelerators in the country, according to TechCrunch. So nice. Kind of dovetailing back into like the business and tech hats. Yeah. When I sit in the selection committee, my role is to be the most technical person in the room, but still be able to connect the dots for everyone else. So like we listen to a pitch from a company and I say, okay, here's what they're really building, or here's what they've really built, and here's what it means for the business. And then I help them to digest like the technical aspects of the company we're reviewing.
Nice. So if I ever want to move to Hawaii and get a job, I should call you.
Yeah, well, there's actually a program that we started this year called Movers and Shakas.
Oh, really?
I didn't start it. When I say we, I mean the state of Hawaii. I have nothing to do with it. Where they actually got like funding to encourage people to like move down and just live down here for a while and like do some work remotely for whatever job you already have. And they're going to help you kind of get set up with housing and stuff. And in exchange, you have to do a little community service around like teaching skills and like sharing your knowledge and doing talks and stuff.
Cool. So tell me a little bit about what you're doing now. Tell me about Valence.
So Valence is an ISV. It's a managed package, and its intent is to be a standalone middleware platform natively in Salesforce. So you're running an integration engine in Apex, and you don't have any third-party server involved. And that came out of a consulting business. I told you I've been doing Salesforce for a long time. I did consulting, and we're doing a lot of complicated projects, weird, complicated technical stuff, right? So that's my thing. And we kept getting integration work, and I thought, man, there's got to be a better way to build integration in Salesforce without going like for a huge engine, like an Informatica or Jitterbit or something. Can I just say something that's very Salesforce-centric that understands Salesforce really intimately? And handles all the nuances of the platform gracefully. And so that's the idea for it. And the Salesforce incubator was just getting started as we were trying to think about this ISV. So we actually turned the consulting business into an ISV, which is the whole thing. I've done some talks on it. It's a great story.
Nice. Well, tell me a little bit more about that. Like, what's the technology behind all of this?
So kind of connecting that back to the custom metadata type stuff that we're talking about, the CMDTs really allowed you to do some interesting dependency injection where you can change the moment in time where people are making decisions about what's going to happen and when. And so that's a really important part of building an integration engine because people need to be able to customize it and configure it and make it do what they want. So using custom metadata types is one half of the sort of core skeleton of how people interact with Valence at a technical level. The other half are Apex interfaces. So we use a lot of micro interfaces that have one or two methods defined on them. And we say, okay, this is the contract for behavior. The custom metadata type record is a registration and some configuration about that behavior. So you might say, okay, do you know how to detect schema? Can you tell me about schema? That's an interface. And then there's a registration record in a CMDT somewhere that says, hey, this Apex class can tell you about schema. Here's how to invoke the class. And it's going to comply with this particular interface. So it's a 1-2 punch with the interfaces and the custom metadata types. And with those combined, you can build a very dynamic, very dependency injection friendly and admin friendly framework that allows for sort of all kinds of flexibility around extension that you couldn't even imagine when you first built it.
And when you say you couldn't even imagine, you had people from Salesforce basically telling you that they didn't think this was possible.
When I walked around and said, hey, I'm gonna build from scratch a fully native middleware engine in Apex, people said, you are out of your mind. That's never going to work. But it actually works really well. We put a lot of work into it, but we can move like millions of records. And we've even built like a parallel engine where you can like move stuff in parallel. It's crazy. Like the stuff you can actually do in Apex with all the asynchronous stuff like cubables and batch and platform events and like chaining it all together and sort of like orchestrated this crazy synchronized dance of all these different pieces moving together has been one of the most challenging things I've ever done on the platform as a developer.
Nice. Well, it sounds very weird and advanced.
Well, fully native integration in Salesforce would be.
And that's our show. Now, just on a personal note, I'm recording this portion of this episode Tuesday, May 11th, 2021. My wife and I have finally gotten our second shots here in Chicago. And it's also finally beautiful weather here in Chicago. So looking forward to being able to get out there into the world again. And it just so happens one of the things I'm looking forward to also is Chuck's favorite non-technical hobby.
I'm going to go with cycling.
Nice.
I like cycling a lot.
Nice.
I try to spend as much time as I can out on my bike.
Nice. Has the pandemic slowed that down at all, or are you still getting out?
No, you can still get out.
Nice.
It's I mean, we were in lockdown for a while, but recently it's been not a problem at all.
I want to thank Chuck for the great conversation and information. And as always, I want to thank you for listening. Now, if you want to learn more about this podcast, head on over to developer.salesforce.com/podcast, where you can hear old episodes, see the show notes, and have links to your favorite podcast service. Thanks again, everybody. Stay safe out there, and I'll talk to you next week.